Sunday, a wonderful article that went out and dealt with a lot of the specifics, and so that's not going to be my focus this morning, as well as tonight. I got tickled. Ed stopped me at the back, and he and I had been talking Wednesday. I tried to push this off on Bob and Ed so that they could shorten it and simplify it and summarize it, because the longer I worked this week, the longer it got, the more information was there. And I went from it being one to it being two. But Ed stopped me because he remembered the text. And so he told me, we're talking about Mark 16 today. I said, no, we're talking about that tonight. I had to change, because Mark 16 is really the second part of the principles. And so we're going to go back to Joshua 6 and talk about some principles that have to be understood, a foundation that has to be laid before we get to direct statements and examples and implication. So Joshua chapter 6 verse 10, you can title it Jefferson Starship if you want to. You can title it Ascertaining Biblical Authority, as Brother Deaver did. We've been working on these evidences. We have been working on why we believe, the evidence that God exists, why we believe the evidence that God created, and so on. We've talked about some of the things that we do believe. What we're looking at today is how we authorize our beliefs, or how God authorizes them, and then we come to understand them. As I said, some have been single, some have been double. This one could really go on for weeks, because you could take each one of these means of how God gives His authority to things, and you could talk about that particular one for a week. But we're going to try to get it in two, using Joshua 6. The reference to Jefferson Starship, the song was, "We built this city on rock and roll." The idea of a foundation on which they were building their civilization. Matthew 7, 24 through 27 talks about our foundation. Talks about the idea that there are multiple foundations on which we can build, but only one is solid. Only one stands the test of time. And when you get to Matthew 7:24, what Jesus says is, therefore, based on what I said earlier, based on what I said about false teachers, based on what I said about the difference between lip service and obedience, He says, the wise man builds on the right foundation, and the house stands. He does not build on the sand. And understand the context. We lay houses on foundations of packed sand sometimes. Different context. What would happen was the creeks and the streams would dry up and create what are called wadis. And it was flat, and it was smooth, and it was easy to build on, and you could build a house in that wadi without a whole lot of effort in the foundation, and then the rainy season would come and the wadi would flood and your house would wash away. And so Jesus says the wise man chooses the right foundation, and the house stands. And then He says comparatively, those who want to enter the kingdom, and He's going back and tying this to verses 21 through 23, that not everybody who says to me, Lord, Lord, is going to enter the kingdom, but those who do the will of my... He's connecting all of that. He said, those who want to enter the kingdom, those who want to be considered spiritually wise, those who want to be compared to the wise builder, both build on my words as the foundation, and they act on them. And now he goes back and ties it to verses 15 through 20. Produce. They do the right things, and they produce the good fruits, versus the evil fruits of the false teacher. The wolf dressed in sheep's clothing. And as we connect this to other passages, those words that Jesus is speaking in Matthew 7 and the rest of the Gospels, and those words that through inspiration He's going to give us from Acts on through the writings of the apostles and others, those words will judge mankind. They are the foundation on which God is establishing everything that we believe and everything that we do. And now as we begin to look towards these principles of how God authorizes, I want you to understand, in his first letter to the Corinthians, Paul writes that they are to learn not to go beyond what is written. All right, so we're not going outside of the book. And we're not going outside of what is written in the book. We're going to talk about silence in a minute and the idea of going beyond based on God not saying anything about something. We have a book that has been Jude 3, delivered once and for all. We have a faith system that God has established. That's it. So we go back to it. We go back to the book for what? We go back to authorize our worship. We go back to authorize the organization of the church. We go back to authorize the role of women, the plan of salvation, and everything else that we believe and do. This is the standard. But when we get there, here's the issue at hand. Here's the mail out. Here's the thought process today and tonight. When we go to the book, how do we determine what is authorized for us, for Christians in 2025, or next year when we get to it, 2026 or 2030? Is it going to change? Is it fluctuating? What is authorized, and how does God go about identifying that for us so that we can understand? There's a plea for unity of being the same mind, of understanding the same way all the way through the New Testament. And so God expects me to be able to sit down and read it and understand it, and Kim to sit down and read it and understand it, and Joe down the road to be able to sit down and understand it, and come to the same understanding. That there's unity in what we believe because God has authorized it. So how do we determine that? Let's start with this. There are two testaments. That's the way your Bible will be divided. You'll have an Old Testament and you'll have a New Testament. You'll have Genesis through Malachi, and then what we call the New Testament will be Matthew through Revelation, understanding that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are all written under the Old Covenant. And it's not until Jesus dies. He lives, remember what we talked about last week? He's a good Jew. He's under that covenant. But we have two testaments. The first, Genesis through Malachi, is designed to bring us to the second. It is designed to bring us to Christ. It is designed to prepare the world for the moment that Christ will come. And that's what the book of Galatians is about. It's about Jesus coming at the perfect time because God has everything set up exactly like He wants it for that moment. That first one, understand, when you go to the book, is no longer binding. I do not have to go back to Mount Sinai to get my authorization. Remember, Mount Sinai lasts longer, and this is something I've been emphasizing in the teenage class and in the college class, lasts longer than Exodus 20 and the Ten Commandments. When you get to Numbers and you finally see them leave Mount Sinai, what you're going to realize is they've been there for 11 months. Everything that's given in Leviticus is given at Mount Sinai. That's no longer binding on me. It was taken out of the way by the death of Jesus. He fulfilled it. He perfected it so that He could institute a new covenant, a better covenant. Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 9. And as Ed and I were talking a couple of weeks ago, that's what Hebrews is about. This better covenant. That's the one we're under. We're under this second covenant, second testament, Acts through Revelation. Also understand, as those two are being written, there are three distinct religious systems that God establishes at different times that are revealed in that book. There is a patriarchal system. This is Adam until Sinai. This is where God deals with individuals. He deals with the head of houses and He's telling them what to do. There is then the Judaic system or the Mosaic system. It's based on the law. It's Sinai until Calvary. That's where we're picking up in Exodus 20, and we get the 10 Commandments, and then we get the other 17 or the other 700 that go with it, so that we get the book of Leviticus and we get all of these details that they have to keep. Then there is a Christian system. Begins at Calvary, and it is the one that will last until the end of time. These are the last days. There's not going to be any other after. It has nothing to do with time in the sense that the last days are about to run out, but simply that they're the last in the system. There's not going to be any more afterwards. Everything we believe, everything we obey must be authorized under that final dispensation, under that Christian dispensation, from Calvary on, and revealed in that second testament. That covenant. That is what is binding on us. That's our law book. So we go to it. But we look around our world and we realize we can all start in the book of Acts and we can all go to the book of Revelation, and we do not all understand it the same way. There's no unity. We still must be able to, 2 Timothy 2 and verse 5, Paul uses the term rightly divide. That's how we write it out. It literally means to cut straight. We have to learn how to cut the book straight to be approved. Side note, leave it to a tent maker who's cutting cloth and animal skin straight to make it work, to use an image that means get it right to be approved. To do that, we have to understand, we have to know how God binds, how God authorizes. And we're going to get to that in a little bit, and we're going to get to it even more tonight. In that process, we have to be able to determine what is faith and what is opinion. In John chapter 3, Nicodemus came to Jesus by night. That is faith. That is stated in the text. The why he came by night is not. We have our opinions. He didn't want to be seen by everybody else. All these kind of things. They're opinions. They're not binding. I can say he came at night because he didn't want to be seen by the Jews. Mimi can tell me he came at night because he slept during the daytime and he worked at night and he was awake. And they're matters of opinion, and we cannot argue about them beyond, reasonable banter or whatever. Difference in faith and opinion. We have to be able to determine what is temporary and what is permanent. Paul tells the Corinthians to earnestly desire spiritual gifts. That's temporary. That is not binding on me today. I cannot earnestly desire gifts that He has taken out of the way. Because he's going to go on as he's writing in that context and say these are limited. Prophecy's limited. Love's the one that's going to last. We're going to understand in full, and we're not going to need those things anymore. We have to understand what is incidental and what is essential. And we're going to use this one again tonight a little bit. But when Paul has his vision in Acts chapter 16, and he's told, come to Macedonia to help us. That's essential. It is essential that Paul gets up and he goes to Macedonia. What is incidental is how he goes. He goes by ship. He could have gone by foot. He could have swam over there. All right? Difference in what is incidental and what is essential. And most of these will make an appearance as we move forward. They'll come into the other things that we're talking about. So how does God authorize? How does God bind on us today? And I'm going to give you 2 book suggestions. You're welcome to write them down, take pictures of them. Go read them if you want to for extra reading. Ascertaining Bible Authority by Roy Deaver is the one that I would recommend more so than When is an Example Binding by Brother Warren, because Brother Warren writes up here, and I live down here, and he makes my head hurt. Now, Ed studied under him. Ed Mike can explain him to you better than I can. But they're both good. They help you understand logic. They help you if A is true and B is true, then C has to be true, and so on and so forth like that. Vital thing this morning. Hear me. To understand how God authorizes, we must also understand how He does not authorize. God does not authorize upon the basis of my personal likes and dislikes. All right, this book is about God. Worship is about God. Obedience is about God. I can like it all day long and God disapprove. And so He doesn't authorize what I'm allowed to do, to think, to worship, whatever, based on what I like. Really example, kind of crude, but anyway, Solomon liked women. God didn't approve. So His approval was not based on Solomon's likes and dislikes. It's not based upon convenience. Nadab and Abihu took a shortcut. They used whatever fire they had at hand rather than getting up and going and get what God had told them they could use. He didn't authorize it. It's not authorized based on what pleases me. It's not authorized upon erroneous conclusions I may reach. I can go to the book, take my presuppositions, or not put in the effort to rightly divide, come to the wrong conclusion and expect God to say, hey, I agree with you. It doesn't work that way. God means what He means, and that's what it means, period. Whether I get it or not. It's not about the basis of my opinion or the opinion of others. I can pick up the greatest journals written in our world today, the most in-depth commentaries written, and find a false conclusion and say, hey, well, this is what so-and-so's opinion is, and that's my opinion too, God. You got to bow to that. And God says, no, I do not. It's not based on what's popular. You see beliefs and trends come in and out of the religious world all the time. God's not shifting sand. It's not upon the basis of the teaching of an individual or a school or a website or a lectureship or a book. It's not based upon truth. Well, I've done it this way for years. God has to recognize it. No, He doesn't. Israel had been doing it that way for years. God said, I'm taking it out of the way. Israel's trying to go back to it. It's part of what Galatians is about. Let's go back to the law. And God says, no, I don't authorize that anymore. It's not authorized based upon my ability to, well, I don't see any harm in it. Doesn't matter if I see any harm in it. God has spoken, and that settles it. Now here's the big one. That's why we're in Joshua chapter 6. God does not authorize on the basis of silence. People appeal to everything in that list I just gave you. And we could spend a lot of time working through all of them. But the last one is the one of emphasis for this morning, because it is one of the major arguments that is used for so much false teaching. God does not authorize based on silence. Brother Deaver wrote it this way: the Bible authorizes by what it says, not by what it does not say. And that repeat up there, that should say God does not. That's a typo. So we go to Joshua chapter 6. Joshua and the children of Israel are sitting on the Jordan River. They've gotten across, and it is time to take Jericho. And they look, and it's closed up. Gates are shut. People are in their houses, and they are terrified of the Israelites. And so God needs a plan as to how He is going to allow them to take the city of Jericho. And so He comes to Joshua and He says, verse 3, "You shall march around the city, all the men of war circling the city once for 6 days. 7 priests will carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. On the 7th day you will march around the city 7 times. The priests will blow the trumpets. And it shall be when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and you hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people will shout with a great shout. That moment, if you've done what I authorized, the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people will go up, every man straight ahead." So listen to what he says, and listen to what he does not say. What does he say? Walk around the city once a day for 6 days. Now then, if I walk around it once, I've done what God authorized. But He's silent as to whether or not I can walk around it 2 times, or 3 times, or 4 times. Does that mean He authorized me to walk multiple times? What did He say? All right, what else did He say? He said, you're going to have the priests, you're going to have the trumpets, but when the trumpets sound on the 7th time, on the 7th day, then you can shout. He does not say that I can shout on days 1 through 6. He does not say that I can shout on day 7 while walking around the city the first 7 times. He does not say that 8 priests can carry the trumpets. As long as I get in 7, God, I'm good. So I'm going to add 8, I'm going to add 9, I'm going to add 10. Based on silence, I can argue anything in the world. But notice, when Joshua comes to explain it to Israel, he understands what God said. And so what does Joshua say? Hush. For 6 days, and then on the 7th day for 7 trips, you're not going to make a sound. You're not going to talk to each other. You're not going to shout. And then when I give you permission, based on God's permission, to shout at the sound of, then you can shout. Based on silence, I could have argued that they could shout anytime, all the time, as long as they get in the last one. Joshua didn't see it that way. Joshua said God's silence on the issue means that I shout one time at the end of the whole process and not before then. Silence would allow me to argue that I could use 8 priests or 9 priests or 7 priests and a Levite as long as I get in 7. Joshua didn't see that. Joshua explained silence to mean, he said 7 priests, that's what we're using. Joshua understands that silence authorizes nothing. Absolutely nothing. So he explains 7 priests, no shouting, no talking, no singing, no anything vocal until the last trip. And when we get to the shout, it's a shout. It's not a squeal, it's not a sing, it's a shout. And it's in unison. And it's when I tell you, and it's after the blast of the trumpet. Notice, silence did not authorize them to do anything else. You can go back and you can see that in the story of Noah building the ark. You're going to build it out of gopher wood. You're going to build it this big. Well, what if I want to build it bigger? I got your dimensions in there, but I'm going to build it bigger. And gopher wood's on the other side of the world, so I'm going to build it out of balsa wood, or I'm going to build it out of pine. Silence didn't authorize any deviation from the plan of God. Those are principles that God used from the beginning, and He continues to use today. One of the best examples of this is, and it involves one of the great figures of all of history, in all of faith. It's towards the end. Moses, they're whining about water again, so go speak to the rock. Notice God did not tell him, do not strike the rock like you did the first time. He said, go speak to the rock. So Moses can go speak to the rock and strike the rock, right? Because God's silent. Must not work out that way. Must not be what God authorized, because God says, Moses, you're not going. This as far as you're getting, you're not going into the promised land. And there are principles He continues to use on and on and on. In the New Testament or in the gospel account, still under the Old Testament, the blind man, go wash in the pool of Siloam. Notice He did not have to tell him, go wash in the pool of Siloam. Do not wash in the Jordan River. Do not wash in the pool of Bethesda. Do not wash in your sink at home. All He had to say was, go wash in the pool of Siloam. And that eliminated everything else. Silence does not authorize. Why does God do it that way? Number one, it's practical. How deep does the book have to be if Jesus lists every pool the man's not allowed to bathe in? How deep does the book have to be if God eliminates everything that He's already eliminated by silence? We couldn't tote it. We couldn't thumb through it. We have to get on a ladder to get to the top page and open it up. So it's practical. Second of all, it's common sense. If God tells you to shout at the sound of the seventh trumpet on the seventh trip, the law of exclusion in common sense eliminates everything else. And so as we get ready for tonight, understand this up front. God does not authorize by silence. If the New Testament authorizes everything about which it is silent, if the New Testament authorizes everything that it does not explicitly forbid, we can have burnt offerings. Let's build us an altar. Hey, I'm building fires in my backyard all the time. I would love another place to build a fire. We can sacrifice our children. He forbid it in the Old Testament, but He didn't come forward in the New Testament and said, hey, don't sacrifice your children to Molech anymore. He didn't tell me we can't use temple prostitutes. Did He authorize them because He was silent? He said use fruit of the vine and unleavened bread, but He didn't tell me I could not use peanut butter and jelly and milk. He didn't tell me I couldn't marry a turtle. If God authorizes everything about which He is silent, we can basically do anything we want to do, anytime we want to do it, any way we want to do it. But it doesn't work that way. Silence, when it's God's silence, is loud. And it is pointed. Those are all ridiculous conclusions. And yet the same rationale is used for those who argue for instrumental music. Ephesians 5 and verse 19, Colossians 3 and verse 16. What do we see? Well, in Ephesians 5:19 we see speak. That can be vocal. It can be through sign. Psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, singing, which is again vocal. How does the elf define singing for us? Singing is just like talking, except it's louder and longer and you move your voice up and down. Making melody in your heart. What do you not see? You do not see God saying we cannot dance out our songs. Why? Because He didn't have to. He said sing them. God does not say that we cannot sing hard rock, pop, country, whatever. Why? Doesn't have to. He said sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. Eliminated everything else. God does not have to say, or did not say, that we cannot play an instrument. Why? He doesn't have to. He said that you sing. That's all He authorized. God does not have to tell us not to make melody any other way. Why? He doesn't have to, because He said the melody's coming from the heart. And when you go and you add Colossians 3 and verse 16 to that, what else do you see? The Word of Christ richly dwell in you. So all of a sudden, we now have a source for where these songs are coming from. They're going to be scriptural. They're going to be biblical. They're going to be authorized by God. Wisdom, teaching, and admonishing, psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, singing with thankful. Oh, by the way, there's the melody, thankfulness in your heart. And so we're now tying some things together. But what do you not see? God doesn't have to explain that our singing of psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs are not based on some other word. Why? Because He said, let the word of Christ dwell richly in you. So we don't go to another source for our words. What you don't see is God having to tell us that we cannot sing other types of songs. Why? Same reason He didn't in Ephesians 5 is because He's told us what kind we can sing. We don't have to have God telling us that instruments are not authorized or any other melody. Why? Because He's told us where the melody comes from. Law of exclusion. He said sing. Any addition to sing is a deviation from what is excluded by the word sing. Now, very quickly, we'll talk about expedience tonight. Is there room for expedience? Is there room for a psalm book or for a pitch identifier or a projection? Why are they not eliminated by silence? Because they do not replace what He said to do. They do not add to what He said to do. They simply assist in carrying out the command to sing. Now tonight we're going to look at Mark 16. We're going to look at how He does. If He doesn't authorize by silence, how does He authorize? We're going to look at the fact that God authorizes through direct statement. Do this. We're going to notice that He authorizes by example. And then we're going to notice that He authorizes by implication. And then as we're doing that, we'll see these exclusions pop up again. And we'll see expedience pop up again. Biggest key for this morning, we can understand this book. We can know what it authorizes because God has given us the rules to use to see what He authorizes. And number two, God does not authorize by silence. Do not buy into the falsehood that our world throws out there constantly, and even the brotherhood. Well, God didn't say I couldn't, so that means I can. No, God does not authorize by silence. He says what He says, and that's where His authority is established. That authority says that Jesus Christ died at Calvary for the forgiveness of my sins. We looked at that crucifixion this morning. That authority says that the way I participate in that death, burial, and resurrection of Christ Jesus is through obedience to the gospel. Through death, burial, resurrection, and appearance in a watery grave. That I repent of my sins, that I confess Him as Savior, I submit to that death, that burial, and that resurrection, and I'm raised a new creature. My sins are washed away, and I am authorized to be a child of God in His kingdom. If you've not acted on that authority this morning, please do so as we stand and sing.
This is